So today I want to talk a little bit about RGB hubs and where and when to use these, along with some of the controllers that you would pair up with them. If you're new to RGB lighting, it can be kind of a daunting task to determine what equipment you need because there's so many different types and flavors of it out there. So what is an RGB hub? Well, that can mean a bunch of different things, and there's just no way possible in one single video to go over all of the different products that are out there, the different combinations of hubs and repeaters and splitters and controllers and all sorts of things. What we really want to focus on today is what we mean by hub generally is we're going to take a source RGB signal, whether it be a 5 volt or a 12 volt signal. We're going to take that source signal, plug it into a device like this, and basically it's just going to repeat the signal out through a number of different ports. Now, this particular device I have with me today has 8 RGB ports. These are 3-pin standard RGB connections. So basically it's going to take my source, go through here, and it's going to repeat. Now that's another term we'll use. Instead of splitter, I'll use the term repeat, because the same signal that you plug in is the same signal that's going to go out each individual port. Now let's contrast that with Corsair, for example. A Corsair is also a hub, and it has 6 RGB ports on it. We're talking about the Core XT. There's a lot of variation there as well, but we use the Core XT for an example. And the IQ software can address all 6 of those ports individually, whereas these hubs, it's not going to address each port individually. It's not aware of that. It's just going to take the source signal and repeat it out each port. So let's say you input the color red. Everything on here is going to be red regardless of what it is. You can't make one port red, one port green, one port blue. So a couple of characteristics we should talk about these hubs is they're generally powered. Most of them lately that I've seen are using SATA power connections, means a SATA power connector is going to plug right in here. Now, a lot of these will be either 5 volt or 12 volt, but some can do both. This particular hub has a little selector switch on it, 5 volt, 12 volt. Now, it can't do both at the same time, but if I put it into a 12 volt mode, and I connect the 12 volt RGB connection cable to the 12 volt port, say on a motherboard, it's going to take the RGB signal from that 12 volt connector, plug it into here, and then it's going to send that RGB signal out to 5 volt devices. So it's kind of a way to convert that signal from 12 volt to 5 volt. They make specific devices to do that, but this particular little hub does that, and it works quite well. I've tested that multiple times. It works good. So now, as far as an RGB source for this hub, there's any number of devices that can do that. The one that we think of primarily is your motherboard on your PC. If your motherboard supports RGB lighting, it's going to have one or more RGB ports. Now, that could be a combination of 5 volt ports and 12 volt ports, but that's a great way to control RGB, and you get software control with that method as well. But usually that's a single port on your motherboard, and there's not a whole lot you could do with that. Of course, you could just plug in a single device to that, but that's marginally helpful, right? So the idea is that you'll take the sync cable that comes with your hub, plug it into here, and then it'll have a 3-pin ARGB or 4-pin 12 volt RGB on it. You're going to take that, plug it into your motherboard, and then voila, you take that one port. In the case of this hub, you've expanded it into 8 ports. There's any number of different sources other than your motherboard. There's little simple basic RGB controllers like this. This one's from DS LED DESS. This has a number of different routines in it. Comes with a little remote, but again, it's just a single port. You need some way to take that single port and convert it into multiple ports. The hub is a perfect way to do that. This fan kit also comes with this basic little RGB controller with a single port. Now, the fan kit does come with a splitter cable which plugs into there and fans it out to multiple devices, which you can also do that as well. It's basically the same concept of this. One of the key differences to a splitter cable in this device would be a lot of these RGB hubs are going to be SATA powered, which means that it's only taking the data signal from your source. It's not actually getting powered from the source. Now, how I use the RGB hubs is I do use them with Corsair. Now, the Commander Core XT, the Commander Pro, the Lighting Node Pro, they all have a 3-pin RGB connector on it. Now, that's a Molex connector that Corsair is using, but with an adapter cable, and I've got videos on that adapter cable, you can take that and you can adapt it to standard 3-pin RGB. Now, what I will do is plug that cable in and then sync it to this. And what I can do from there is I can then plug in just standard 3-pin RGB products. I can sync it up with the Corsair IQ software. So this is a way that I will get multiple non-Corsair RGB devices linked up with iCUE. In addition to that, if you use that particular solution, plug in your adapter cable, sync it up with this. You can then use this to sync up, say, Lian Li controller, a Thermaltake controller, a couple of non-Corsair RGB lighting strips, for example, or recently I used the RGB cable combs that would plug into a hub like this. So one trick you could use to get more than one color out of your RGB devices would be to use more than one hub. For example, this motherboard has 3 RGB ports, 2 5-volt ports and 1 12-volt port. I could use 3 hubs, for example, and say connect all my front fans to one hub, my top fans to another, and some other random 12-volt RGB devices to yet another hub that's in a 12-volt mode. From there, I can control all 3 of those ports individually, putting a different color to each one. And you could get creative as to how you split that up. But just consider that if you're looking to get a little bit fancy and get more than one RGB color. Another thing you'll see embedded with this is a lot of these will be fan controllers as well. Now it's going to take the same exact concept, meaning it's going to have a sync cable back to a source, a PWM source to be more specific. So it will plug into a fan port on your motherboard. It'll take the PWM signal in here, and it will then repeat that out to all of the fans that you have here. This is similar to most fan hubs. It will get the RPM feedback off of fan number 1, and then it will just control all of them together. So you don't get individual zones of control or PWM control over individual things. It just controls them as a whole. Most of these hubs, whether they're just an RGB hub or they're an RGB/fan hub, don't require any software control. In fact, there is no software control over them. They're just simply taking a source signal from whatever source you have. Now that source might have software control, and that's fine. So in turn, you could think of that as you do have software control over this device, but there is no software to run this. It's just a hardware link back to your source, and from there you can control it. But you will find devices that take this one step further, and they're going to merge those 2 functions in with your source. So basically, this one from CoolMoon, and again, I'll link to these products below. This is going to do PWM fan control, RGB control, but the controller is built in here as well. So this would be your source. This would do everything for you. This is a pretty inexpensive controller. I think it's about 20 bucks, but it comes with a remote. There is no software control to this device. It is all just through the remote. But this would be a great solution. Say, for example, if your motherboard didn't have any RGB ports at all and you didn't have Corsair and you didn't want to spend the money and you just wanted kind of a simple, quick, easy solution, something like this one from CoolMoon would just be a great way to do it and just get some really basic RGB. I found that some of the lighting effects on these are actually pretty cool, but it does give you just, you can select some basic colors, but it gives you lots of capability, and you could also sync Lian Li controllers and Thermaltake controllers to one of these RGB ports on here as well. Gives you basic fan control. There's not going to be anything fantastic about it. There's no fan curves or anything like that on most of those. It's, it's usually a high, medium, or low type speed. But for most basic setups, something like the CoolMoon controller is going to do just fine. So let's just recap where you would use the RGB hub. Now, if I just had a single motherboard RGB port and I wanted to fan that out to many devices, the RGB hub is one of the first things I'm going to go grab. Depending on what kind of equipment you're installing, you may find that the equipment you're installing already has a controller with a motherboard sync cable, in which case you don't really need this. But if you just have some, standard 3-pin RGB strips and fans that don't have any other type of controller or anything with it, this is going to be what you're going to want. You're going to sync this into your motherboard. The motherboard's just going to repeat it out, and you're off to the races. And so if you don't have an RGB source, meaning your motherboard doesn't have RGB control, consider something like the CoolMoon. This is a great way because it gives you everything all in one, RGB, fan, and a controller as well as a remote. You could opt for one of these really simple, cheap little controllers. This will just give you really basic lighting. Obviously, you could step it up and go with any of the Corsair solutions. Lian Li, you could go all Lian Li so that you're using their controllers for everything. But let's say you're just starting out and you don't have any RGB source at all. You could just do one of the cheap controllers and a hub, and it's pretty inexpensive. That's provided you've already got all the RGB devices, you know, fans and strips and whatnot. But so where I use it, again, I use it with Corsair personally. I take my Corsair RGB port, adapt it to 3-pin ARGB, plug it into this, and then I can plug in multiple devices and sync it up with iCUE. Works great for that. That's where I've primarily used these. So I hope that gives you a basic idea of where RGB hubs can be used. They're great little devices. I will link to all of these products in the description below. Let me know in the comments if there's a specific device you want me to take a look at, or if you want a specific review over any specific hub or have any questions about it. Let me know. I'm happy to help out when I can, the best I can. That is going to do it for today. Thanks for watching.